I am Mary Sketch with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and I am for the soil to protect the landscapes, waterways, and resources that provide the food that we all eat and the lands that we recreate on for current and future generations.
Thank you for tuning in for this edition of For the Soil, a Conversation. We want to welcome you, especially if you're a new listener to this podcast. We are now going into our second year of production of this podcast. Eric Benfelt and Mary Sketch Bryant and myself. By the way, I'm Jeff Ishii. I'm the host of the program. It's our pleasure to welcome you. And this podcast is not only about soil health, it's about people involved in agriculture, people involved with gardening, people who are interested in the health of our soils. By the way, I'd also like to direct you to our website, forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4, thesoil.org. And there you'll find a blog section, and we recently posted a blog concerning how to keep the soil covered with plants and organic materials. There's a lot of resources there from the Piedmont Master Gardeners, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Clemson Cooperative Extension, the Edible Schoolyard Project. Just a lot of good resources. Once again, that's forthesoil.org, and just click on the blog there and you will see a lot of information on how to keep the soil covered with plants and organic materials. Now, I need to offer an apology. I was late entering this podcast. My alarm clock didn't go off. I was busy in the radio studio, and I joined a few minutes into the podcast. Let's go ahead and jump in with Eric Benfelt and Mary Sketch Bryant on this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation.
Mary and I are very pleased to have Brian Downing here from Crooked Row Farm in Asheboro, North Carolina. And for myself, the way I was introduced to Brian, I happened to be reading a book by Gabe Brown, Dirt to Soil. And in that book, there's a chapter on Will It Work on Your Farm, where Gabe Brown shares a number of case studies, and Brian's story was shared in that book. And I was intrigued not only on how Brian became involved in agriculture, but then his journey with soil health and, looking at, different practices and tools, and just wanted to learn more about your journey, Brian. So if you'd like to share how you got involved with farming and maybe your interaction with Gabe Brown and your journey with soil health, Mary and I welcome that.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to join y'all this morning. And just a little bit about myself. I am I guess you want to call it a second generation. My grandmother and grandfather had a farm. My little introduction to agriculture. In high school, I got bored. I had my driver's license and I started mowing grass. Well, it saved me up a little bit of money, and I'd like to buy some cattle. So I went out and bought a couple calves from a friend of mine, and that was the beginning of my demise in the cattle business. I've been enamored with cattle ever since, and agriculture in general for that matter. Just the desire to see things grow and come to fruition through hard work is really what drives me personally. You see that cow, you raise the cow, she has a calf, she raises the calf, and then you hope to make a little profit at the end. It's not about the money. It beats the corporate hustle and bustle in a wholesome way. After I was tinkering with cattle, I introduced poultry and pork into my operation. And then I introduced produce up until 4 or 5 years ago. Well, 2 or 3 years ago, I had all 4 entities on the farm: beef, pork, poultry, and produce. But like I was saying earlier, nature has an interesting way of limiting your abilities. I had 350 laying hens on pasture. And one day I started noticing some odd behavior in those birds. And I sat there and looked at them for a minute, realized that there was a pair of bald eagles that were feasting themselves on the poultry flock. So I was out of the chicken business in a couple weeks. So I just sort of, chalked it up. I ain't gonna be able to raise chickens here. Well, I've then just introduced a handful of other things. I mean, look at microsites, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself. Look at microsites on your farm, shady spots, mushroom cultures, drains off of side of a barn, gutters, farm by the square foot. If I had to say anything, farm by the square foot, if you have the availability to. The way our communities are growing right now, we're going to be farming by the square foot in just a few years anyway, out of necessity. But I know that's a little bit of a tangent there. I still raise beef, pork, a little bit of produce, more for myself now. I will sell a little bit of beef and pork, raise a few broilers for myself, sell the excess. Just trying to slow down and just enjoy, being a part of agriculture.
And
Morning,
Brian,
everybody.
Good morning, Jeff.
Hey.
Morning.
We were just
Brian, it's a pleasure to meet you, and you telling that story. It reminds me, one of our previous guests talked about that connection with the soil, and you were talking about farming by the square foot. And I remember he talked about every once in a while he takes his shoes off and farms barefoot so he can actually feel that connection with the friability of the soil and all that entails. But interesting story, and we definitely encourage stories on this podcast.
Good deal. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I ain't quite got to the farming barefooted yet. I got snakes and rocks, and I'll keep the boots on, but just know that I'm connected.
Where is your operation?
Central North Carolina, Randolph County.
Randolph County. Randolph.
Yeah,
Okay.
25 minutes south of Greensboro.
And one thing, Brian, that we also want to, what are, people's resource concerns? And I know in what the reading that I've done, I think you had reached out to Gabe Brown about a soil compaction issue, and building off Jeff's talk about walking barefoot in soil, that when it's compacted, it presents challenges.
Absolutely. That is correct. I had a compaction issue. About 65% of my farm is considered by Randolph County to be floodplain. So, I mean, you can imagine in the construction world, it's not worth a hill of beans, but in the agricultural world and cropland, it is magnificent farmland, flat, bordered on three sides by a creek. I mean, it is uptown corn raising land. And I would notice after big rains, it's nothing for us in late April, early May to get 2.5, 3 inches of rain in one session. And that can pose issues when you go to check your cows and there are fish swimming around in your pasture because the creek got out of bank. But the water would hang around longer than I wanted. I'd have mud holes 2-3 weeks after that rain event. So, I purchased this farm from my grandmother, and they had been continuous grazing cattle, haying the land, just not managing the piece of property in a regenerative manner. So I realized I had a problem when you got fish swimming in your cow pasture. So I reached out to Gabe, And I told him, I said, I can't get water to go in the ground, in layman's terms. And he said, okay, so what do you need? I said, I need to break up a hard pan, I guess. And we went through and we just kind of off the hood of the truck came up with a cover crop mix that was diverse, deeply rooted, and I planted it. And that fall I went and looked around where I had planted this particular mix, and I had macro aggregation in year one. And that sold me right there, because I knew right then, if what a man in North Dakota was telling me worked in North Dakota, it would work in North Carolina. I've got 120 more growing days per year. I can create soil health and regenerate soils much faster than he can. And I'm saying Gabe, just through the ability to diversify and keep a living root in the soil much longer through the growing season. So that was my start. I went off the deep end from there. I've planted, I know in another presentation, I said 5 to 7 species blends. I've went 15, 18, 20, whatever I could go to southern states and get, I'd throw in the drill. I mean, it didn't matter. I don't care if there's a squash beside a sorghum Sudan and a cowpea beside a green bean. I don't care. I just want the diversity. Now I'm grazing it with livestock. So it doesn't matter to me what plant's out there, because it's either going to be eaten and turned into nutrition for the livestock, or it's going to be trampled and turned into nutrition for the soil. So I think we get caught up in what to do instead of how to let a cow take care of herself. Like the famous baseball movie, I can't even think of it, Field of Dreams. Just build it, they'll come. Your cows will take care of themselves. Your worms will show up because they're out there. You've just got to provide the habitat for them to exhibit their individual distinctiveness.
And Brian, I'm also a big fan of Dirt to Soil, and I guess that came out, what, four years ago, about 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, at least.
Okay. So would be interested in how you've continued to experiment and build your soils over that time. You saw, it sounds like pretty rapid improvement in the first couple of years, but what it's been like since then.
Okay, I'm going to preface that with another statement or scenario, so to speak. Think of soil ecology like your checking account. We, as a society, our currency is dollars and cents. The currency for ecology is carbon. That is the key. So if you can introduce a new carbon source, you're going to excite this new microeconomy over here, maybe by the wood line. And then you introduce a new form of livestock, and you may excite another microeconomy. That being said, I don't think you can make a mistake when it comes to applying the soil health principles. I don't think you can plant a too diverse mix. I have planted 18 to 20 species mixes, like I was saying earlier. I don't care what's out there. If it's a briar, maybe the goats will eat it. I don't know. But we're going to try it. I still kind of stick with for the animal performance side, I still try to stick with a sorghum Sudan base in the summer, winter wheat, triticale, barley, rye mix or base for the winter or cool season, intermingled various legumes, brassicas, broadleafs, warm season, cool season. Try to keep a base, but then diversify within that base is what I personally try to do. Just to see, do I get a better stimulus from this mix, and record keeping is another important thing. I'm not the greatest record keeper. I try to, cubby hole a lot of stuff in my head. Not that I'm being secretive. It's just easier to, stick it up here than write it down. But I truly feel like record keeping is a way that you can track past performance and extrapolate future performance in terms of, if this done this, can this do this, or will that do this? And it can build a framework to drive your own personal soil health journey.
It's interesting. You talked about currency and carbon being the exchange rate, if you will. Give me an example of how you add carbon to your soil.
For 3 years ago, I bought a sawmill. I thought, well, the way I looked at it, all my friends are, 55, 60, even 70 years old. They all worked at a sawmill, if at least in my area. If you look back to the people or that generation that worked in the sawmill, they're fairly affluent. So I said, well, if it worked in the, 60s and 70s, or 50s, 60s and 70s, why wouldn't it work now? So I went and bought a sawmill, and it held true. The standard held true. It was a very good deal for me. But the byproduct of the sawmill business is a carbon dense source, or a source of carbon density, wood. With that waste product, I would basically build a bedding pack in a little old rundown shed. And I don't know, Joel Salatin, the figurator aspect, I've basically done that, which is build a bedding pack, impregnate it with corn, continue to build with wood chips, keep adding corn. And then in the spring, when the cows go out to, adaptively graze the fresh new grass in the pasture, you put your hogs in to rummage through the corn or the bedding pack, seek out the corn, aerate the bedding pack, and create this wonderful carbon dense compost and spread it on your fields. And that's one way. These covers, if you have it all goes back to your resource concern. If you're looking for peak animal performance, you're not going to let sorghum Sudan grass get 14 feet tall. But if you're looking for carbon, or if you're looking to increase your armor on the soil profile, on the soil surface, let it get to maturity and then graze it, because you're going to have much more biomass above ground. The livestock are naturally going to eat less, so they leave more, which increases your armor, therefore increasing your savings account, so to speak, of carbon density on the soil surface. And that's just one or two, rather, opportunities.
And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. We want to once again thank our special guest, Brian Downing of Crooked Row Farm in Asheboro, North Carolina. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of Mr. Smith. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.